Hello. Do we recommend Norwegian salmon is a question. I'm answering a question from my Facebook fan page, Chef on a Mission. And Daniel said, do you recommend Norwegian salmon? So first off, we do not recommend Norwegian salmon, and here's why. If any of you have watched any of my videos, have seen any of my work, I'm a huge advocate of wild salmon versus farmed salmon. Now, in Norway, when you see Norwegian salmon, all of Norwegian salmon is indeed farmed. It's Atlantic salmon, it's farmed. The farming industry actually originated in Norway in the 60s into the 70s. And by the 80s, especially by the late 80s, the Norwegian government said, you salmon farms are just totally destroying our environment. Now, salmon farms have come a long way in the last 10 years. The technology, it's the so-called sustainability of salmon farms have come a long way. The industry, here's the problem with the industry. The industry is set up to where it's going to be very hard to succeed to begin with. Okay, so you're taking, most salmon farms are put in the migratory path of wild salmon. So what that means is, and this is really happening in British Columbia in the last 15, 20 years, I mean, the wild salmon population is collapsing when they do this, because what happens is they are spreading the disease into the wild, into the migratory path of the wild salmon, the farm salmon. So when you naturally put a colony of salmon that close together, the density is like 2 salmon per bathtub. So if a salmon farm goes, well, we do low density farming, that really means 1 salmon per bathtub. So you'd have these football field sized pens out in the ocean just sitting there. It's called open net pens that are just breeding hundreds and hundreds of thousands of salmon per pen. You're going to have disease. It's just what happens. You put any creature close together, whether it's cattle or anything, you're going to have disease. That disease spreads out to the wild salmon in those areas. Now, most salmon farms, the best salmon farms, or where they put the best salmon farms, is going to be in the migratory path of salmon, because that's where the wild salmon live the best. That's where they thrive. So the farms know that. So that's where they put the farms at. Now, there are certain parts in the southern hemisphere, like Chile and New Zealand, where they actually put salmon farms. There's no wild salmon there whatsoever. But that disease that they're breeding still spreads out. And I know if you do a lot of research on salmon farms are there to sell you their product. Whether it's from Norway, whether it's from Scotland, whether it's from the Faroe Islands. You're going to log onto these websites and see these pristine waters, these beautiful backdrops, and these pens sitting out in the ocean. Some of them even say farmed in the wild, because they want you to give that impression that the salmon farms are out there in the wild with the wild fish. But the fish can't go with the wild fish, and they're contained to these pens. So you put fish that close together, you start getting disease, you start getting lice, you have to start treating the water. In Canada, they're very upset, especially on the east coast of Canada. The local lobster farmers, the lobsters, the people who fish for lobster, and a lot of the other people that rely upon these bays are up in arms with the salmon farms, because the salmon farms throw such harsh chemicals into the water that it kills the lobsters, it kills the other things in these bays, where they have no viable income anymore. Now, Norway abused the Norwegian waters, or the farms abused the Norwegian waters so bad that these salmon farms had to now, these massive salmon farms had to now go into other countries to start their salmon farming. And Canada opened the doors wide up for salmon farming, wide up. They said, come with us, come here, you can have whatever you want. Basically, in Canada, if you have a disease in your salmon farm, by law, you have to put all the salmon down. Salmon have to be put down, they have to be killed. The Canadian government actually gives these salmon farmers full retail value, up to like $25 million, some ridiculous retail value for all the salmon that's in there. So it gives no incentive for the salmon farmers to actually raise better quality salmon that don't get sick. If the salmon gets sick, they go, oh well, the government's going to pay us. We don't need insurance for this, the government pays us. Most of these small communities are up in arms about this, because the government won't give them a librarian in the library, but they'll give the salmon farms millions and millions of dollars. But back to Norway, the Norwegian salmon farms. So has the Norwegian salmon farms actually improved quality? Well, they have improved quality over the years, because the pressure is mounting for these companies, for these salmon farms, to do a better job. Are they doing the best job they can be? Now here's the real bottom line with all salmon. Not, I'm going to say all, but the majority of the salmon farms. Here is the bottom line. It's an industry that is tough to win at. It's an industry that's tough to do the right thing, because you're taking salmon, you're putting them in pens, you're feeding them a very high fat food, a very, very high fat food that's treated with chemicals that preserve the fat in the food, that are toxic chemicals, where they're harvesting fish from the wild. It's a 3-to-1 ratio, so they're harvesting three times the amount of wild fish to raise 1 pound of salmon. It doesn't make sense. Salmon, when they're swimming out in the wild, they're eating plankton, they're eating a varied diet. When they're in a farm, they're eating a very controlled diet of what the salmon pellet companies are making, and usually that's a very high fat. Salmon need a high fat diet, a very, very high fat diet. So the Norwegian salmon farms rely upon stuff from the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is polluted, where they're getting all these small fish that they're just harvesting to turn into salmon pellets in the salmon meal. So in the fat is where all of the contaminants live and get transferred from one species to another. We all heard of how bioconcentrating happens in the wild. So if one fish eats another fish, eats another fish, eats another fish, all the toxins from that very first fish to the last fish get passed along and concentrated in the fat of the fish. Well, that's what's happening with the salmon farms. Extremely high fat food, treated with nasty chemicals to stabilize the fat, or the fat goes rancid very quickly. Okay, so it's like how olive oil goes rancid. Well, they treat that so it doesn't go rancid. There is a new type of salmon farming that is happening out in Norway, and there's one farm that I'm aware of in British Columbia called Kutera, and it's called inland farming, or contained farming system. Contained farming systems happen to be the way of the future, but here's the major problem with that. It takes $7 million to build a farm as opposed to $1 million to build a farm. That's a major difference for a salmon company that's trying to regain or recoup its initial investment. Now, an inland farm, most salmon farms, 99.99% of salmon farms, are located out in the ocean, in water. They're in nets. The nets have holes in them. So anything that the fish do, like go to the bathroom, have disease, all that goes right out into the bays, into the water, into the migratory path of the salmon. And that's where the little baby fish, the little baby salmon fry, when they swim past these farms, their body is not, the salmon's not that far enough developed to fight anything off. So it's actually killing the wild salmon. I know you're going to go to a lot of websites, farm salmon websites, that say, oh, we're saving wild salmon, we're saving wild salmon when you eat farm salmon. That is the total farthest thing from the truth. You're actually having a major detriment on the wild salmon by eating farm salmon. If the salmon farms disappeared, experts are saying, like Alex Morton, marine biologist from British Columbia, is claiming that the wild salmon populations would totally rebound. So we've been doing farm salmon for decades, for 50 years in the Atlantic Ocean, and there's no rebound yet. In fact, it's getting worse and worse, the wild salmon population in the Atlantic Ocean. So if that was true, we'd see population gains, and that's just not happening. So inland farming, a containment system. A containment system is where you build big, massive pools inside of a structure, inside of a building. Okay, that costs a lot more than throwing nets out in the ocean, obviously. 7-to-1 ratio of how much more it costs. So the salmon get put in these huge pools. It's constantly creating a current. It's being pumped through there. But what happens is, when the salmon gets sick, the diseases don't spread out into the ocean. Diseases actually get filtered through a high intense filter, where then the water's repurified and pumped back through the salmon. So it's a containment system. It's contained where nothing goes into the wild. They create such strong currents in there that the salmon can actually grow 2 to 3 times faster. They eat less food, and there's no need for any antibiotics. But again, the salmon farm, the upfront cost is $7 million versus $1 million. So there's really not many salmon farms that are actually doing their job and saying we're going to spend $7 million versus $1 million and do the right thing, and not have to use antibiotics and have it's very short-sighted for the salmon farms to say that they can't afford this, because the long run, they're going to make more money and they're going to have better yields. Now, there's one salmon farm that's in British Columbia called Kutera, K-U-T-E-R-R-I, Kutera, and it's owned by the Native Americans in British Columbia, and they have massive yields based upon farming in the ocean because of this inland system. But again, $7 million to install this, and no antibiotics, the water's filtered, nothing goes out. See, in the natural, in nature, if a salmon were to get sick, a wild salmon, a true wild salmon gets sick, and end up dead on a shore somewhere or floating out in the ocean, that would get scooped up by a sea otter, it would get scooped up by an eagle when that salmon's just sitting there not moving, right? And then that sea otter or that fish would have a way to actually dismember what made that salmon sick to begin with. So a pathogen, a germ, that eagle, that fish would actually now be able to kill it off by consuming that wild salmon. But in a farm, there's just way too much of these pathogens, these germs, these lice, these sea lice. Now the interesting thing is sea lice are killed by fresh water. So when an adult salmon, a female, swims past a salmon farming, the sea lice attached to the salmon, that female salmon is going to lay her eggs in the stream. So it's swimming upstream. So as soon as that female salmon hits fresh water, the sea lice die and fall off the salmon. But now here's the part that's not good. Once those salmon hatch and the little baby fry swim past the farms, the sea lice that attach onto the baby fry salmon that now go live their life in the ocean never have a chance. Probably less than 50%. And Alex Morton is a fantastic resource for this. She's been studying this since the late 80s, since 1988, 89. And Alex Morton, I've actually interviewed her on my YouTube channel. I have some great interviews with her on really what's happening in British Columbia, what the impact of the salmon farms are. And my last interview with her, she's been there for literally since the late 80s. She's saying, Marcus, there's not enough salmon swimming upstream anymore to spawn, which means there's not enough food for the bears to live on, the grizzly bears. She goes, you have mother grizzly bears that are running around streams frantic looking for food, knowing that they're not getting enough food for the winter, knowing that their cubs and their life are in danger. She goes, Marcus, it's really scary to see these bears running around frantically for food when there's no wild salmon left. And she has made a direct correlation with the decline of wild salmon with the rise of the salmon farm. She went there originally to study whales, the killer whales in that region. And she goes, Marcus, the whales are disappearing, the bears are disappearing. She goes, everything's disappearing, and these salmon farms keep popping up out of everywhere right in the path. She goes, when this first happened in 1989, she goes, I went to the government and said, Marcus, I said to the government, you can't put a salmon farm in the migratory path of salmon. It's going to be a major detriment. And they told her to shut up, don't worry about it, they know what they're doing. And she sat back pulling her hair. Nobody was listening to her, nobody whatsoever. And now, of course, the whales and everything are going to the wayside, and people are starting to listen to her, but she's going against these multinational corporations that own it, like Marine Harvest, which is a massive company, and they pump tons of money in. They tell the government, they tell the fish ministry what they want done, and there really is no fair way to monitor these farms or enforce these farms. They're supposed to report all of their flu viruses and everything that actually are on the salmon. So Alex Morton has gone to grocery stores and bought local farmed salmon from British Columbia, taken the salmon right off the grocery store shelves, sent it to a lab, got it analyzed, and it showed up positive for these flu viruses that if a salmon farm were to have these, they'd have to shut operation down. So she goes to the government, goes, hey, I have proof that these salmon farms have these germs. And the government's going, well, that's inconclusive. That's totally inconclusive, and we don't believe you, basically. And so she has a lot on. She's really going up a force that does not want to be taken down. But check out Kutera. Again, I still an advocate of wild salmon versus any farm salmon, because you still have to harvest the food from somewhere, no matter if you're an inland farm or you're farming out in the ocean. You still have to produce the food, catch the fish, add some kind of chemical stabilizer to the fat so it doesn't go rancid on you. Jamie asked, where can the average consumer buy quality salmon? Well, this time of the year, ShopRite actually has decent quality wild salmon in the fresh counter. But again, I'm a huge advocate for frozen salmon, because what happens is they'll catch it at the site where the boats land, in the bays. They'll catch the salmon right then and there and freeze it instantly within hours of catching it at a very low temperature, like -80. They'll cryogenically freeze it. And so the fish doesn't start aging. The fish doesn't start decomposing. The fish doesn't hit rigor mortis yet. So when you take this fish home, this frozen fish from Whole Foods, a health food store, you can buy it online. Vital Choice, by the way, has fantastic salmon. Vital Choice, I think it's vitalchoice.com. I worked with them years ago, like 10, 12 years ago, I worked with them. So you buy these fish that are frozen, these fillets that are frozen, and they've had no time to actually have microbial growth on them. So when you defrost it at home, it's basically hours when the fish is caught, and that's when the microbial count starts to build up. The average fish sits in a warehouse, and by the time it gets to the plate at a restaurant or to you in a grocery store, it can be 7, 8, 9, 10 days old. And seafood will last 21 days. Believe it or not, I was shocked when I heard that as well. I heard that back in the early 90s. I was at a seafood seminar from Stephen Connolly, seafood distributors out of Boston. They were meeting with us, and they basically told us fish last 21 days, and I didn't believe it. So in 1998, I did an experiment. I got fresh, live tilapia that was delivered live to me in Colorado, and we cleaned it as soon as it got in. We used gloves to handle it. We iced it down every day. We kept it free of any kind of bacteria, covered it with plastic, drain, ice. We kept it for 20 days, and it smelled fine, and we cooked it and we ate it after 20 days, and the fish was fine. So yes, it is true, fish will last a long time. So when you go to the grocery store and you think that you're buying fresh fish in a grocery store like ShopRite, what's fresh? 7 days, 10 days old, 12 days old. Some of these boats that go out in the Georges Bank off of Gloucester, these boats go out for 12 days and they're catching fish. Well, they start catching fish at day 2 and 3, and they're still catching fish at day 10. When they get back to the dock and they have the cod, the monkfish, whatever they went out to catch, the scallops, that fish, the same cod, right? The same cod from the Georges Bank, whether it's top of the trip, which is the last days, or the beginning of the trip, has two different prices, two drastically different prices. The stuff that was caught the first few days goes to the grocery stores because they know that consumers are very price conscious. And they know that high-end restaurants will pay twice the price of a consumer. So that fish actually gets segregated based upon its freshness and goes in two different sales routes. So when you go to ShopRite or any grocery store and buy cod, and you're paying $5-6 a pound, and then I turn around to go to my distributor who buys high quality top of the trip, I'm paying $7-8 a pound for cod, okay? So I'm paying more than you can buy it for in the store, and it's the same boat, same trip, different catch days, and that's how that works. So it's really hard to go to a grocery store and say, I want super fresh seafood. You really need to go to a seafood monger that you can trust, a seafood store specifically, where they're very, very knowledgeable about the fish and can tell you when it was caught and how it was caught. That's a big factors now. You can say, oh, that was line caught, it was long line caught, it was netted, it was caught Tuesday in Montauk, and it was here Thursday at the market to sell. See, so that's how that goes. The more questions you ask and the more questions they can answer, the more trustworthy that fishmonger, that fish store is. Of course, New York City, we're near New York City. New York City probably has the better fish retail stores than going somewhere upstate, just because people in New York City are willing to pay more for it. Now, believe it or not, Fulton Seafood Market in New York City is not really the best market to pull from. If you're a restaurant, a chef, and you're I'm buying from Fulton, buy all my fish from Fulton. Fulton is a secondary market to Gloucester and Boston. That's where all the fresh seafood that's coming from cleaner waters, it goes to Boston and Gloucester, and then it gets shipped somewhere else. So Fulton, there's no really boats coming into New York City that say, hey, I just went out for the day and just caught all this fish off of New York City and brought it back to the market of Fulton. So Fulton's a secondary market, basically. So if you hear a chef saying, oh, all my fish comes from Fulton, I'd be kind of wary about that, okay? Not saying that they don't do all great stuff or all better stuff, but it's a secondary market. And again, the best seafood comes frozen. And whether it's shellfish, whether it's soft shell crabs, because they're harvested 2 hours from shedding their shell, and then frozen instantly, so they don't have to sit in a box and die on their own and go through stress. There's certain things you always buy alive or fresh, like lobsters, of course. If you're buying Maine lobsters, you want those alive. Frozen, there's really not big of a market for a frozen whole lobster, although some companies do it, but most chefs don't go that route. So Norwegian salmon is always 100% farm raised. Anything that says Atlantic salmon is always 100% farm raised, and just because it says king salmon, some king salmon's farm raised too. That's what they're actually raising in New Zealand, and that's what they're raising in British Columbia off of the west coast of Canada is actually king salmon. So don't get confused if you see king salmon. If you see Atlantic salmon, 100% always farm raised. Hope that helped you. Leave some comments. I'll monitor this on Facebook and answer some questions. Jamie, I hope that helped you. Go to a health food store. Go to vitalchoice.com. Go to any kind of site that's actually selling high quality wild frozen salmon. You can actually go onto Pike Place Market. That's a big market in Seattle, and kind of monitor the seasons of what's actually getting harvested wild. So you might go to a restaurant and say, oh, we have this beautiful wild salmon and it's January and wild salmon's not in season. And the chef's like, oh, I got fresh wild salmon here. Just go onto Pike Place Market and you'll see if they're selling fresh wild salmon at Pike Place, it's available. If they're not selling it at Pike Place, it's not available. Pike Place is that market that they had that TV show on where they throw the salmon across the booths. Pike Place is the market, people. It's in Seattle. It is the market for fresh seafood. It's a consumer market. It's a wholesale market. If they don't have it, chances are a restaurant's not going to have it. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, leave some questions. I'll be happy to do another Facebook Live and answer it. Thanks for tuning in.